So I thought we could talk about how the belief in justice or a just world can actually, in application, lead to great injustice in society. Um, so to start off with, beliefs about justice and retribution in the United States have been deeply shaped by religious culture. White evangelical Protestantism remains especially influential today. These beliefs help to construct a moral universe in which hierarchy and punishment feel not only reasonable, but godly. In much of US evangelical theology, God is portrayed as both perfectly loving and perfectly just, with justice strongly linked to retribution. Sin must be punished, and suffering is often interpreted as the consequences of sin, bad choices, or rebellion. So this creates a powerful expectation that moral cause and effect should be visible in everyday life. If God governs the world, then what people reap must match what they've sown. So that expectation maps easily onto the psychological just world belief, which is the idea that people generally get what they deserve and deserve what they get in life. When that theological framework dominates, it becomes very difficult to accept random, undeserved, or structurally produced harm without feeling that God's justice, and therefore one's own worldview, is being threatened. The pressure then is to reinterpret victims' suffering as somehow morally meaningful, even if this requires blaming victims or spiritualizing away systemic causes. So, prosperity oriented strands of evangelicalism, and I have made an entire other video on the prosperity doctrine, but they tend to intensify this dynamic. Teachings that faith, obedience, and positive confession bring material blessings, while doubt, disobedience, and wrong beliefs bring hardship, make worldly outcomes look like a direct scoreboard of someone's spiritual status. Wealth, success, and health become signs of divine favor, while poverty, illness, or victimization become potential signs of spiritual decay or moral failure. Within such a framework, acknowledging innocent or structurally produced suffering on a large scale, for example, racialized poverty, mass incarceration, or anti LGBTQ violence, would destabilize the theology. If people are not clearly in control of the conditions of their suffering, then blessings and curses can no longer be read as reliable feedback from God. To avoid that conclusion, communities are nudged towards finding something wrong with the victim. Bad choices, lack of faith, sexual immorality, unbiblical lifestyles, or corrupt culture. This allows their suffering to be read as meaningful judgment or discipline rather than evidence of injustice. Evangelical teachings around gender and sexuality also shape how harm is interpreted. When strict gender roles, sexual purity, and cis heteronormativity are framed as divine mandates, people who depart from those norms are implicitly marked as morally unsafe. Women and girls who experience harassment or assault may be questioned about their modesty, behavior, or wisdom, rather than about the perpetrator's actions. Queer and trans people may be told that family rejection, homelessness, or mental health struggles are natural or even inevitable consequences of rebellion against God's design. Survivors within churches may be pressured to forgive, submit to leadership, or avoid gossip, while abusive leaders are framed as anointed, attacked by Satan, or fallen but repentant. These examples illustrate how suffering is folded into a story of divine order and rebellion, and pain is seen as something that flows from disobedience. Harm done to those outside the norm can thus be read as what happens when one refuses God's will. This makes it easier to excuse or overlook the responsibility of perpetrators and institutions because the victim's nonconformity is centered as the real issue. Evangelical subcultures in the United States often emphasize obedience to authority. Pastors, parents, husbands, and the state as part of God's design. When scriptures like Romans 13, the submit to governing authorities, are stressed and weaponized, state institutions such as police, military, and immigration enforcement are framed as God's ordained instruments to reward good and punish evil. Within this framework, law and order politics align neatly with religious duty. If the state's use of force is presumed to express God's justice, then police violence is more easily interpreted as necessary correction of lawbreakers or those who resist authority. Harsh criminal penalties, deportations, and punitive welfare regimes are more likely to be seen as morally appropriate consequences rather than as policy choices that can be unjust or oppressive. In addition, protests against state violence can be painted as disorderly, rebellious, or even satanic, rather than as legitimate demands for justice. Because the state is religiously coded as an agent of divine order, people harmed by it must have done something wrong, at least belonging to a culture of disorder. This protects both state power and the religious community's sense of alignment with righteousness. In the US context, evangelical theology developed within a racialized social order. In many white evangelical spaces, racial inequality has often been spiritualized rather than historicized. Instead of centering slavery, segregation, redlining, and ongoing discrimination, inequality is frequently explained in terms of individual morality, such as work, sexual behavior, or fatherlessness, or in terms of cultural traits like respect for authority, community priorities, or even spiritual states, such as distance from Christ, lack of a revival, or a wrong worldview. This shift in focus from systems and history to hearts and cultures produces a pattern in which racialized suffering is read as the product of bad cultural and spiritual choices, implicitly deserved at the group level, while white advantage is read as evidence of virtues like diligence, family, and stability, or God's blessing. Structural remedies such as reparations, redistribution, and policy reform can then be criticized as misguided or even unjust because they appear to reward those whose suffering has already been coded as deserved. Evangelical communities also place strong emphasis on personal moral identity, being Bible-loving, Bible-believing, pro-life, values-driven, and aligned with God's will. This makes it especially painful to confront evidence that one's own community, doctrines, or leaders are implicated in abuse or righteousness. There is a powerful incentive to treat reports of abuse or racism as attacks on the church or on God's work. This often leads to questioning the motives, credibility, or spiritual maturity of victims and whistleblowers in a moralistic attempt to reinterpret systemic problems as isolated fails or falls of individuals and spiritual warfare. Just world and retributive assumptions provide the emotional cognitive tools for that defense. If suffering reveals sin, then perhaps people who claim to have been harmed may be suspected of hidden misconduct. Kind of reminds me of the logic of the Salem witch trials. Anyway, if God is in control, then acknowledging widespread injustice can feel like saying God has failed, or that the community has profoundly misheard God. Rather than face that dissonance, communities may double down on narratives of desert, blame, and spiritual deficiency, reinforcing existing hierarchies of gender, race, class, and sexuality. When evangelical, just world, and retributive logics combine with US political, racial, and economic structures, they perform several functions. They sanctify existing hierarchies by presenting them as reflections of divine order and moral desert, rather than as outcomes of human power and history. They moralize and spiritualize the suffering of marginalized groups, framing it as deserved consequences or discipline instead of as injustice. They provide religious rationales for obedience to state and institutional authority, muting critique of policing, incarceration, border control, and punitive social policies. In addition, they protect the moral innocence of privileged groups and institutions, making calls for accountability or structural change feel like attacks on God, faith, or the Bible itself. In practice, this means that religious belief is not just a private matter of comfort or hope. It actively shapes which harms are seen as unjust, whose pain qualifies as real victimhood, and which forms of domination, retribution, and control are perceived as necessary, righteous, or even loving.